So now we'll be looking at the late classical. And the late classical basically comes at the end of the Delian League's betrayal. So as I mentioned, Pericles, he basically, you know, goes against the rest of the city-states by stealing their money. And this touches off the Peloponnesian War. The area of Greece is called the Peloponnese. So again, basically what the term for the war means is that it was all of Greece fighting each other. So good job, right? You basically did what you said you weren't going to do. And one of the reasons that they shouldn't have fought each other, why they should have unified, why they tried to unify and it just didn't work out, is because they didn't want to leave themselves open to outsiders. So Pericles, his move, causes everyone else to get very angry with Athens and fight each other again and leaves them open to outside invasion once more. And with that, we have the arrival of Alexander the Great, or the Macedonians in a sense, because his father, Philip of Macedon, of course, was the first to lead military campaigns into this region, and Alexander is the more well-known, right, figure, right, who leads the Macedonian forces into this region. Now, what was interesting about Alexander is, how he won the Greeks over is he basically said, well, what would you want if we could fight for you? What would you want? And they were like, we would love for you to kill the Persians. With Persians, we hate them. And Alexander was like, okay, we can take care of that. Because if you look at Alexander's conquests, he reaches into Asia, right? He ends up destroying the Persians. If you go back and look at our discussion of the Persians, Darius and Xerxes do end up getting served up violence, right, by Alexander the Great, and the Persian Empire is taken down that way. So why do the Greeks, in a sense, adopt Alexander as one of their own? They do so because he promises them justice. He promises them that he'll have their back. And so they end up not really viewing him as an outsider. They view him as a savior, and come to accept Alexander as one of their own. But as I'd mentioned to you, Alexander kind of brings a different attitude into the mix for the Greeks. He was known to be openly bisexual. We know that from the documents, that it's historically noted. And so we think he brought kind of a different perspective on sexuality to the Greeks, who had always been more sort of male-centric and male-focused, as men looking at other men as equals, and allowed for more openness towards sexuality, and more freedom in general. So to me, the early Greeks seem kind of uptight a little bit. Being perfect, it doesn't give you a lot of latitude to be free, to have a lot of fun. Perfection is hard. It just takes a lot of work. And so I look at the early Greeks and I'm like, they're kind of uptight. They're kind of, perfection really kind of brings that out of them. And I think when Alexander and his people arrive, they bring kind of a freedom, a laxness, a looseness. And I think you can see that very much in the art. I mean, just look at this Praxiteles piece I'm showing you, the Aphrodite of Knidos. First off, it's a nude woman. She's on display, right? She's sexualized for our consumption. This is something you wouldn't have seen in the classical or the archaic. Women would not have been shown to you this way. Why would you? So again, I think there's a lot of shifting in perspective and attitude that happens with Alexander. Here we start to see it a lot in the sexuality and the playfulness of art. And then by the Hellenistic, you see a real theatricality and very open sexuality in their pieces. Beyond just the titillation of something like this, you start to see very overt suggestiveness. So I look at the first half of Greek art history as being very buttoned up, very perfect, very precise, and I look at the kind of the back half as being looser, freer, more emotion-driven, more story-driven. So, it's one way to kind of think about the time periods. Now, I wanted to show you Praxiteles' work as a great example of late classical sculpture. Notice he's taken the realism that was developed by something like Critios Boy, the contrapposto, the chiastic. It's using all of that and then expanding on it to include a new focus on narrative, I think. Narrativeness and also sexy suggestiveness. So it takes what the classical artists were doing and just modifies it a bit, updates it a bit for what these people wanted, what they would have been interested in. The Aphrodite of Knidos, the way I always read her is she's either getting in or out of the bath, and so she's disrobed. And in a sense, we are the viewers. We are the ones who are looking at her and surveying her. In art history, we call this the gaze. Predominantly the male gaze, because think about it, really until quite recently, it wouldn't have been women gazing at these pieces. So this idea of the gaze, the male gaze, the sort of sense of her sexiness being directed to the viewer for their consumption, for their pleasure. But it's like, to me, we've snuck up and we're kind of spying on her, and she's caught sight of us. She's either putting her garment down or picking it up, and she's like, oh my, and she's gone to cover herself. Again, I think it's meant to be more of a narrative piece and much more of a playful piece, where Praxiteles has taken the idea of Critias' boy, which had no context and no story, and given it something kind of fun as a story that drives it. The other reason why I think this is a really good reading of the piece is because originally it stood in this type of temple that we call a tholos temple. A tholos temple was a round-shaped temple, and you could approach it from any side you wanted. And so I think, this idea again of us sneaking up on her and peering in, and her standing there, and we're sort of like, she's like, oh, there's something to be thought about when you think about art as theatrical, right, in nature. Another really great Praxiteles is Hermes and Dionysus that you see here. Another way of thinking about theatricality and narration in art. Notice that all of these Praxiteles are copies. So if you're paying attention, you should be thinking these are not originals, they're not bronze. They have braces, so you should be, okay, these are copies, right? So notice that, again, copies are much more common than originals. Now, what is the story of Hermes and Dionysus? Hermes was the messenger of the gods. He was often enlisted to do the dirty work of the gods, or send their messages, or communicate for them. And in this story, he's taking the baby Dionysus to the forest to grow up. He's been asked to take him to protect him. If you know Zeus's story, you might say, this sounds kind of similar. Because again, Zeus, you'll remember, Rhea Silvia, his mother, fed, Zeus a rock, essentially. Fed Kronos a rock, right, rather than Zeus. And Zeus was spirited away to grow up in the forest. So in a sense, Zeus is doing the same thing for his child that was done for him. The reason why he has to, send Dionysus off is because this is another of his children born by his getting around, and Hera had said, I'm going to kill this baby, I'm going to kill Dionysus. So that's why Dionysus had to be protected. But poor Hermes, right, Zeus is like, hey, can you go collect my illegitimate kid, and take him off into the forest, and I'm sure Hermes was like, okay, for the 80th time now, sure, I can do that, boss. And so if you think about it, this is a story that, seems to have some urgency to it. Go get this kid, protect him, do it now. But if we look at the sculpture, doesn't it seem like they're kind of playing with each other? They're kind of, it's leisurely. So what Praxiteles does is he picks out a playful narrative part of the story. We originally think that the broken arm of Hermes held up a bunch of grapes, that he was dangling, and that the baby Dionysus was reaching for them. Because Dionysus, of course, becomes the god of wine and partying. So it indicates who Dionysus will be. But I always think this is a very late classical way of trying to go about a sculpture by not making it about the serious thing, but making it about the funny thing, or the fun thing, or the, entertaining thing. So it fits right in, I think, with late classical values in that way. Again, if you're looking at the sculpture, notice it uses the contrapposto, it's using the chiastic, it's using all the things that classical artists taught. But I actually think Praxiteles makes it even more elegant. He kind of pushes the limits of what he's doing and energizes it even more. It becomes like a thing of beauty, right, with what he's creating. This is Lysippus, another great late classical artist. His work, The Scraper. And Lysippus actually created Alexander the Great's portrait heads. So if you go back and look at the portrait head of Alexander, that was actually created by Lysippus. So you might notice there's a similarity in the hairstyles. Because Alexander wanted to have what he called lion's mane hair. It's like a reference to the god Hercules. And there's a very similar idea with the scraper's hairstyle, right, and Alexander the Great's portrait head. Now, the Greek name for this piece is the apoxymenos, but it translates to the scraper. And this is a different twist on how to show athletics, where we saw Myron's Discobolus, and I'll show you a compare-contrast slide here in a second to compare again that piece with this piece and contrast it. So we're used to seeing like active energy, I'd say, with classical renderings of fitness. Notice here we're at a different point. We're at a resting point. So again, the late classical, I think they go for more complicated narration, more complicated stories. What athletes at this time did is they covered themselves with oil, and then once they were done exercising, they would scrape their skins to remove the oil. And when they removed the oil, they thought they were taking away the dirt and the perspiration, right, the sweat, that they were taking all the impurities off their skin. This was their way of cleansing their skin after working out. So they'd cover themselves with like olive oil, basically, and then scrape it. Different than us taking a shower, but you get the point. This is the way they cleanse their body. So instead of being in the midst of an active thing that he's doing, we're with him kind of at rest afterwards. It's a different perspective on athletics, I would say. Notice that this is a copy, of course. You have the tree trunk in the background. And I always mention a little bit about the fig leaf. When you see a fig leaf on a Greek statue, that was not original to the statue because, as we talked about, the Greeks, they believed in the body beautiful. They didn't have any qualms about the human body. Naked, nude, they were all about it, To them, the body was a beautiful thing to celebrate. So when you see a fig leaf over the private areas of these men, this is something that was done later during the Christian era of the end of the Roman time period. So if you see fig leafing, as I mentioned it, you're looking at something that was done by Christians towards the end of the Roman time period to these statues they had copied from Greek originals and then alter one more time, So it's interesting to consider what the original Greek statue looked like, the bronze, and then the copy before it was fig leafed, right? So it's kind of like 3 different iterations. But Greeks would have never fig leafed these, and Romans didn't really have an issue with the body either before Christianization. So it's definitely a morality thing that is introduced with Christianity when it comes into play. So again, this is something to consider. And again, if you look at the discus throw or the Discobolus against the scraper or the apoxymenos, again, I think they show you the attitudes of the classical and the late classical and help for you to consider the difference between the two, and again, how, it's a very different attitude as we're moving along. The final time period we're going to look at is the Hellenistic, and to me it's the most fun. It's the one that's going to focus on the theatricality of art and also sexiness, true overt sexiness in art.